think we're live. Yes, we are live. Okay. We are. Good afternoon, beloveds. Let's start there. We are here to read chapter 6 in Reading the Bible again for the first time. And I am doing this on behalf of Creative Life Spiritual Center because Reverend Jesse, this is the textbook that Reverend Jesse likes to use in his Bible wisdom class, but also because it's just a really good book. And what you get with me is my undergraduate degree is in anthropology, and so you're going to get some commentary, one based on my experience as a minister, because I've been a minister, well, I've been with Science Mind since 2005, and I've been a minister since 2017. So yeah, you can do the math. I'm coming up on 10 years next year, so wow. But and because of my love of world mythology, Joseph Campbell is absolutely one of my heroes. So that is where the commentary is coming from. It's coming from the anthropology, from the years in Science of Mind and ministry, and from my love of world mythology, from my love of Joseph Campbell and his theory on world mythology. And I slot the Bible into world mythology. Not from the standpoint of it's fake, but in the standpoint of these are stories that don't have to be factually true to be true. Okay? These are the stories that we tell ourselves about how the world works, what shapes our view of the world. And that's very important. Okay? Now, the author, Marcus Borg, is a Bible scholar and a Lutheran. I believe he's a pastor as well. I've read the preface. It's just been a minute since I've done that. But he's been in the Episcopal faith and the Lutheran faith, and he was in one of the other. It may have been Presbyterian faith, and he is, as I said, a biblical scholar and reads a lot of other and knows a lot of other biblical scholars. So this book is a very kindly take on the Bible, and it is a reminder that what you want to do is look at the moon, not the finger pointing towards the moon. If you don't understand what that phrase means, that is what he is talking about. We want to look at what the Bible points to, not the Bible itself. Okay? And remember what one of my favorite teachers said is that the Bible is not a book. It is a library. It is a bunch of books put together. So as I'm looking for the notes for chapter 6. Yep, okay, got them. Because I find it helpful to me to read the notes, although sometimes the notes just tell you where the Bible quote is coming from that he's telling you. So we are going to get on with this because I've noticed that these chapters keep taking longer and longer. And I want to go watch the Scooby-Doo movie that's coming on at 5:30. So, all right, we are doing chapter 6, reading the prophets again. So we are still in the Hebrew Testament. And yes, we call it the Hebrew Testament out of respect. Okay? Because for an entire faith, it is still the Bible. Reading the prophets again. The classical prophets of ancient Israel are among the most remarkable people who have ever lived. Such is the indelible impression made by their words. Their language is memorable, poetic, and powerful. Their passion and courage are exceptional. Their message combines radical criticism of the way things are with urgent advocacy for another way of being. They disturb our sense of normalcy in several ways, socially, personally, and spiritually, and in their own words, they speak for God. Now, he's probably going to get into this, but if he doesn't, one of the things that my favorite thing that Jesse says about the prophets is that they were bloggers. They were commenting on the situation that they were living in. The prophets wrote during and just after the exile, when Israel was trying to figure out who it was post-exile, post being conquered by the Babylonians and Sumerians and whoever else may have conquered them. So you need to know that. They are not prophets in the sense of the future. Okay, they are not. And that I know he does say. So let's get on to it. But it's Jesse's comment about them being bloggers that kind of got my attention. I'm like, yeah, no, that makes sense. 21st century sense. So, okay, introduction. We move from the Pentateuch, or the law, to the second major portion of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets. The books contained in the prophets are divided into two groups, the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are a collection of historical books beginning with Joshua and including Judges 1 and 2, Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. Judges 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. They narrate the history of Israel from the time of the occupation of the Promised Land until the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. The latter prophets are those books named after the classical prophets. These persuasive messengers of God are themselves commonly divided into two groups, the major prophets and the minor prophets. The designation does not refer to the prophet's relative importance. Rather, they indicate the length of the books that bear the prophet's names. I believe that, Micah is very, very short. It's 3 pages. So that's what he's talking about here. Whereas if you've read, Isaiah or Ezekiel, they're hundreds of pages. The 3 major prophets are Isaiah, 66 chapters, Jeremiah, 52 chapters, and Ezekiel, 48 chapters. The books of the 12 minor prophets range in length from Hosea and Zechariah, 14 chapters each, to Obadiah, 1 chapter, the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. Several are only 2 or 3 chapters long. And we have our first note, note 1. 2 chapters long are Joel and Haggai. 3 chapters long are Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Oh, then I must have Micah confused with somebody else. Okay. We not only move from the Pentateuch to the prophets, we also move forward in time about 500 years, leaving behind the Exodus of the 13th century BCE. For about 2 centuries after the Israelites settled in the Promised Land, they lived as a tribal confederacy. Oh, that's probably an important word. With no centralized government. Then, in about the year 1000 BCE, the tribal confederacy was placed by a monarchy. The first king was the ill-fated Saul, followed by King David, who unified the new kingdom and made Jerusalem its capital. David's son, King Solomon, built the temple on Mount Zion in Jerusalem and extended the kingdom to the greatest size it was to attain. When Solomon died around 922 BCE, the United Kingdom split into 2 parts, the northern king of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom lasted until about 722 BCE, when it was conquered and destroyed by the Assyrian Empire and basically disappeared from history. The southern kingdom was conquered and destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in 586 BC, and some of the survivors were exiled to Babylon. The exile lasted about 50 years, ending in 539, when the exiles were permitted to return to Judah and begin rebuilding their ruined country. The classical prophets belong to the time of the divided kingdoms, their destruction, the exile, and the return. The earliest of these prophets, Amos, began speaking about 750 BCE, some 30 years before the destruction of the northern kingdom. The latest spoke in the century or 2 following the return from exile. Though they had predecessors, Samuel in the 11th century, Nathan in the 10th century, Elijah and Elisha in the 9th, I will focus primarily on the classic prophets. Hearing the prophets for the first time. I have heard the voices of the prophets in 3 quite different ways in my own religious journey as a Christian. My first impression of the prophets was formed when I was a child growing up in the church. In common with many Christians of my generation and before, I heard the prophets spoken of primarily as predictors of the Messiah, who was, of course, Jesus. They had been sent by God to foretell Jesus' coming. Moreover, given that they predicted events hundreds of years in the future, from the point of view of time, it was obvious that they had to be inspired by God. I heard the New Testament itself, especially Matthew's Gospel, speak about the prophets this way. Okay, now we have note 2. For the sake of economy of language, I will refer to the author of Matthew's Gospel as Matthew, even though we are quite certain Matthew, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, did not write it. Just as we are quite certain that John did not write the Gospel that bears his name. Indeed, we are not certain of the names of any of the authors of the Gospels. It was reasonably likely that Mark and Luke wrote the Gospels bearing their name. However, though there is no consensus about this. Okay, so he's just warning you. We're just going to talk about the Gospels as if the writers were the writers, even though we don't know, and in fact don't believe that 2 of them were the authors. Okay, that's what he just said. And it has started raining again. Interesting. Okay, from the first chapter onward, Matthew uses a prediction fulfillment formula. After he narrates the story of an angel telling Joseph in a dream that Mary is pregnant by the Holy Spirit, he quotes a passage from the 8th century prophet Isaiah. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Okay, that's note 3. That is Matthew 1, 22 and 23, quoting Isaiah 7:14. I note in passing that Matthew quotes the Greek version of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint and often abbreviated IXX, not the Hebrew text. And that the Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 does not mean virgin, but young woman. Of course, I did not know this when I was a child. So that's one of the things that you have to be aware of when you're dealing with the Bible. If we go back to the Hebrew text, it says young woman. In the Greek text, they translated young woman as virgin. It makes a difference. Okay, we are back to, so the virgin birth had been predicted. In his first 2 chapters, Matthew uses the prediction fulfillment formula 5 times, all in connection with Jesus' birth and infancy. I cite 2 more examples. After Jesus is born in Bethlehem, Matthew writes, "It has been written by the prophet," and then quotes words derived primarily from Micah. "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." That's note 4, which is Matthew 2:5-6, quoting Micah 5:2. I tell you this in case you want to go back and look it up, okay? Because Reverend Norm says it's always important to read the Bible quotes in context, okay? I took Matthew's claim for granted as a child. The birthplace of Jesus had been predicted centuries earlier. Matthew also tells us that Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus flee to Egypt to escape the murderous plot of King Herod. Like Pharaoh centuries earlier, Herod had ordered the death of all male babies. After Herod dies, they return from Egypt, and Matthew writes, "This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I have called you, my son.'" The quoted passage is from the prophet Hosea. Okay, note 5. Matthew 2:13-5, quoting Hosea 11:1. Used in conjunction with Matthew's narrative, it gives the strong impression that even Jesus' time in Egypt and his return from Egypt had been predicted. In Matthew, as a whole, the prediction fulfillment formula is used 13 times. And though the other authors of the New Testament do not use the pattern so explicitly, many of them correlate events in the life of Jesus with passages from the Hebrew Bible, especially in the Passion narratives, which tell the story of his death. Hearing the Bible in a state of pre-critical naivety, I reached a conclusion that was inevitable. The prophets were supernaturally inspired predictors of Jesus. This reading of the prophets was reinforced by a copy of Haley's Bible Handbook that was in our home. First published in 1924, it soon became a bestseller. As I recall, the edition I knew as a child, there was a 2-page layout of over 100 predictions of the Messiah in the Old Testament and their fulfillment in Jesus in the New Testament. Note 6. While writing this book, I tried to verify this by locating an edition of Haley's Biblical Handbook from the 1940s, but the oldest edition I could find was the 22nd, published in 1959. In it, 56 specific foreshadowings and predictions of Jesus as the Messiah are cited from the Hebrew Bible. See page 356 through 66. See also page 386 through 87. Citing events in the Gospels predicted in the Hebrew Bible. Now, he puts predicted in quotes. Okay. The handbooks claim by the time we reach the end of the Old Testament, the entire story of Christ has been pre-written and prefigured. Okay. Then the handbook asks a question to which its answer is obvious. How can this amazing composite of Jesus' life and work, put together by different writers of different centuries, ages, before Jesus came, be explained on any other basis other than one superhuman mind supervising the writing? The miracle of the ages. Okay. Note 7. Quotations are taken from page 354 and 367 of the 22nd edition. See previous note. That's the Haley's Handbook. Okay. Thus, the prophets predicted Jesus. Moreover, their predictions not only proved that Jesus was the Messiah, they also proved the truth and supernatural origin of the Bible. Okay. Seeing the prophets as predictors of the future was reinforced by the most common meaning of the word prophet and prophecy in our culture. For both Christians and non-Christians, the words often refer to a supernatural, that is more than natural, knowledge of the future. Some people within each group believe that prophecy is possible. Others do not. But both groups agree that this is what prophecy is. In short, the way I heard the prophets the first time is that they certainly predicted the first coming of Jesus and may have predicted his second coming. This way of seeing and reading the prophets is still around. Haley's, it's spelled Halley apostrophe S in case you want to look it up, is still in print. The best-selling Bible handbook in American history, and now in its 25th edition. And mind you, that was 25 years ago, so... Okay. In person or by letter, I continue to be asked by Christians who are puzzled about the historical study of Jesus, what about the argument from prophecy? I no longer see the prophets as predictors of Jesus. Instead, there is another and quite obvious explanation of the correspondences between the New Testament, or the Christian Testament, and the passages from the Hebrew Bible. Namely, the correspondence is there because the authors of the Christian Testament were all Jewish, with one possible exception, and knew the Hebrew Bible, whether in Hebrew or Greek, very well. Thus, as they told the story of Jesus and reflected about his significance, they often echoed language from the Jewish scripture. Doing so was completely natural and legitimate, because if you remember, Jesus quotes from the Hebrew Testament as well to teach many of his story. I think some of his psalms and some of his parables come from, so the prophets were a part of their sacred tradition, and they sought to show continuity between Jesus and the tradition out of which he and they came. Okay? In short, the correspondences are not the product of prediction and fulfillment, but of prophecy historicized. Ugh. In other words, the Christian Testament authors used passages from the Hebrew Bible to generate historical narrative. They did this in at least two different ways. Sometimes they used prophetic passages as a way of commenting about something that had happened. For example, the gospel writers often used phrases or passages from the Hebrew Bible to comment about the significance of Jesus' crucifixion, an actual historical event. Okay, note 8. For examples, see my book co-authored with N.T. Wright, The Meaning of Jesus, Two Visions, from 1999, specifically pages 84 and 5. Other times, they embellish their stories of Jesus with details drawn from the texts of the Hebrew Bible. As the Christian Testament authors historicized prophecy in these ways, they often took a passage out of its ancient context, and gave it a meaning very different from what the prophet had intended. I illustrate with 3 passages already cited from Matthew. Okay. Now, remember what you have to remember what I just said. They often took a passage out of its ancient context. And that's one of the reasons why Reverend Norm, he jumped up and down on this point. He said, when you read a Bible quote, make sure you go back and read it in context. Read the lines before, read the lines below, because that will tell you what the authors intended it to mean, not the way it's being used now. Okay, so that's very important. Anytime somebody quotes the Bible at you, go look it up. Go look it up and read it in context. Okay, see what the authors actually intended it to mean, not what the person quoting it at you is intending it to mean, because they can be very wildly different. All right. Okay, so now we're going to go back to his his examples. Matthew uses Isaiah 7:14 as a prediction of the virginal conception of Jesus, but that earlier text did not originally refer to a virgin birth or to an event in the distant future. Rather, as to the full context of Isaiah 7:10 through 17 makes clear, Isaiah was speaking to King Ahaz of the southern kingdom of Judah in the 8th century BCE. It was a time of crisis. Judah was threatened by a military invasion. Within that historical context, Isaiah telling King Ahaz that God will give him a sign, namely a young woman already pregnant will give her child the symbolic name Emmanuel. Emmanuel is not a proper name, but a phrase meaning God is with us. Okay, that's kind of an important point there. It is not a proper name. Emmanuel is not a proper name. Okay. Isaiah then tells Ahaz that before this child is old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, the crisis will be over. In its 8th century context, the passage promises deliverance to Ahaz and Judah. They will be safe. Matthew's use of Hosea 11:1 in his story of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus returning from Egypt illustrates the same point. Matthew quotes only the second half of Hosea's verse, "Out of Egypt I called my son." But the full verse makes it clear that the prophet was referring backwards to a time to the Exodus, not forward. Okay. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Not only does the passage refer to the Exodus, but it is Israel, not Jesus, who is called God's son. Finally, the story of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem may be an example of prophecy having generated historical narrative. What? Okay, hang on. Prophecy having generated historical narrative. The majority of mainline scholars think that Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, not in Bethlehem. Okay, we have note 9. For reasons for this conclusion, see John P. Mayer, A Marginal Jew Rethinking the Historical Jesus, Volume 1, page 214 through 16. Okay. Wait, where was I? Oh, sorry. Why then do both Matthew and Luke have him born in Bethlehem? Probably because of the tradition that the Messiah was to be the son of David, namely a descendant of King David, Israel's greatest king. As the home of David, Bethlehem was David's city. Indeed, the passage from Micah quoted by Matthew expresses this connection. The future and ideal king, a king like David, will be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. Thus, the story of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem may not reflect the history, but express the early Christian movement's conviction that Jesus was the Messiah, son of David, and ideal king. But I'm getting ahead of my story. I did not learn what I have just reported until later. Nevertheless, setting aside the notion that the prophet's primary purpose was to predict Jesus' coming centuries ahead of time is an essential step in seeing and reading them again. Okay. I had a thought, but I think I'm going to keep it to myself because I don't have it quite complete, and he may cover it. And if he doesn't, then I may look it up and we'll talk about it later. Okay. Hearing the prophets the second time. Well, okay. Part of the thought that I have is when you look at the genealogy, Joseph is actually from the house of David, not necessarily Mary. So for Jesus to be a son in David's line, his father would have to be Joseph, not God. But that's neither here nor there, because again, like I said, and the other thing is because of the way they practice cousins marrying cousins, and it has to do with whether you marry in the matrilineal cousin or the patrilineal cousin. It might matter, because if Israel's one of the groups that married patrilineally, then Mary would have been a cousin in the house of David as well. But if it was matrilineal, she would have come from a different house. So, those are things that you have to think about when you read these things. But it's because, as I said, anthropology. Okay, let's get back to Borg. Hearing the prophets the second time. I began to hear the prophets a second time in college during a political philosophy course. Included in the course was the prophet Amos. Okay, this is note 10. The class was taught by Rod Grube, then a young professor at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. Grube was a remarkable combination of intellectual, political science professor, Lutheran pastor, assistant football coach, and former football player. He later taught at St. Olaf College. I also took a Christian ethics course from him, and it is possible that I encountered Amos in that course and not in his political philosophy course. Okay, so there he was. So he just wanted you to know where he's getting this particular part of his information from. Okay. I learned that Amos and the other prophets of Israel did not write books as if they were recording their predictions for the future, but were masters of oral speech. And that's one of the things you have to remember, is that a lot of the Bible was an oral tradition before it was written down. Okay? For the most part, they spoke short, memorable oracles and addressed people in their own time. Think about people standing on soapboxes on street corners. This is who the prophets were, okay? They were, I don't know about soapboxes, but they were standing on street corners talking to the people, directly to the people. They were not writing these books down. And I learned that the words they spoke were disturbing. The prophetic passion for social justice. Amos was downright electrifying. I was stunned by the rhetorical elegance and content of his inaugural address in the first 2 chapters of the book bearing his name. Speaking to the northern kingdom in the 8th century BCE, he indicates the kingdoms on its borders who were Israel's traditional enemies: Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, and Moab. The oracles against each of these neighboring kingdoms begin with the solemn words, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment." He indicts them for barbaric cruelty in warfare. They have exiled entire communities, pursued with the sword with no pity, and ripped open pregnant women, all for the sake of enlarging their borders. It is as if Amos were pinning up verbal atrocity posters. He announces God's judgment on each kingdom. They will be conquered and sent into exile. He then indicts Judah, the southern kingdom, also as an enemy as Israel. The rhetorical strategy is brilliant. By indicting and pronouncing God's judgment against Israel's enemies, he draws his audience to his side. Then he turns the screw and indicts Israel itself in the name of Israel's God. Now the crimes are not cruelty and warfare, but social injustice within the society. Okay. Thus says the Lord, for 3 generations of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell those who have done no wrong for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the earth, and push the afflicted out of the way. Note 11. Amos 6:2-7, his inaugural address, a modern designation, not one from the text, begins on 1:3 and ends in 2:8 or 2:16. In Amos, I heard for the first time the prophetic passion for social justice. Repeatedly, and not only in his inaugural address, he indicts the wealthy for their exploitation of the poor. You oppress the poor and crush the needy. You trample the poor and take from them taxes of grain. You trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land. Note 12. That is Amos 4:1, 5:11, and 8:4. Oh, and he's going to keep going. Okay, so I am apparently going to be, almost all of this page is going to be Amos. He paints vivid and damning pictures of people whose lives of luxury and yet, who live lives of luxury and yet are indifferent to the misery in their midst. Woe to you who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on your couches, eating lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp and like David improvise on instruments of music, who drink wine from bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph, the poor. Therefore, you shall now be the first to go into exile. And we have note 13. That is Amos 6, 7 through 4. With words as sharp as a well-honed machete, Amos indicts Israel's worship of God. In the name of God, he says that God despises solemn assemblies. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. What then does God want? Amos continues. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like the ever-flowing stream. That's note 14. So that comes from Amos 5:21 through 24. Amos also speaks about the judgment of God, but it is not the final judgment or the last judgment at which individuals will face heaven or hell. Rather, it's God's judgment within history. Societies filled with rampant injustice face destruction. All of this was brand new to me when I was introduced to it in college. Amos was passionate about social justice. Indeed, for him, sin was primarily injustice. Amos spoke of God's judgment not in the distant future, whether at the end of time or when the individual dies, but within history. I had no idea that the prophets were like this, or that there were passages in the Bible like this. For the first time, I saw and heard the Bible without the domesticating lenses of my childhood faith. For me, the encounter with Amos marked the beginning of a new stage in my perception of the Bible, of Christianity, and the world. Okay. I'm going to take a nice deep breath here. The indictment threat oracle. I went to seminary in part because of Amos. There, what I learned about the prophets underlined the impression I had gotten from Amos. I learned that the most common form of prophetic speech was the indictment threat oracle, a form that has two major elements and sometimes a third. Okay, so the indictment, an accusation or a list of offenses. The threat or sentence, what will happen because of the offenses. The summons to the accused, the naming of the offenders. This third element, though sometimes explicit, is often implicit. When explicit, it is most often the first element in the indictment threat oracle. Okay. Seeing the form was and remains very illuminating. An awareness of the most common pattern of prophetic speech helps in reading the prophets because the pattern discloses what they most centrally were doing. In effect, they were prosecuting a covenant lawsuit on behalf of God against Israel. Okay. I illustrate the indictment threat oracle with two examples. The first from Micah, who spoke in the southern kingdom in the 8th century. Jerusalem was the kingdom's capital. Zion was the mountain on which the temple stood, and the house in the last line of the oracle refers to the temple. The summons to the accused. Hear this, you rulers of the house of Jacob and the chiefs of the house of Israel. The indictment. You abhor justice and pervert all equity. You build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its rulers give judgment for a bribe. Its priests teach for a price. Its prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, surely the Lord is with us. No harm shall come upon us. The threat. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. Okay. Note 15, that is Micah 3:19 through 12. The indictment names injustice. The threat speaks of Jerusalem and the temple in ruins. A second example is from Amos. To clarify the first line, Bashan was an area known for its fine cattle. As the indictment makes clear, the phrase cows of Bashan refers to the wives of the wealthy men in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. The summons to the accused. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan who are on Mount Samaria. The indictment. You oppress the poor, you crush the needy, you say to your husband, bring something to drink. The threat. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness, the time is surely coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. Through the breaches in the wall ye shall leave, each one straight ahead. Note 16. Amos 4:1 through 3. The indictment is once again against the oppression of the poor. The threat envisions the city of Samaria after a military conquest, its walls breached through the siege, and the survivors marched off by the conquerors as booty. I like how he puts booty in quotes. Okay. The dramatic power of the prophet. Okay, hang on. I'm going to drink the water. The dramatic power of prophetic arts. In seminary, I also learned about prophetic arts. Sometimes the prophets performed attention-getting symbolic actions in order to dramatize their message. Okay. Attention-getting symbolic actions. These included the symbolic naming of children. Hosea, for example, named two of his children Lo-Ru-Amah and Lo-Ami, Hebrew phrases that mean not pitied and not my people. Note 17. That's Hosea 6 through 18. The root of La-Rumah is the Hebrew word for compassion, related to the Hebrew word for womb, and sometimes used in the Bible to speak of the central quality of God's character. Thus, not pitied means not compassionate, or not treated with compassion a mother feels towards the children of her womb. But because these phrases either do not work well in English or are impossibly long, not pitied was used. Okay. Interesting. That's the problem with translation. Sometimes words, you just can't translate them. You need a whole paragraph to explain what they mean. So you just do the best you can. Okay. The names are a threat. The days are coming. Hosea says Israel will be not pitied and not my, in brackets, God's people. Isaiah named two of his children, Mar-Shal-Hash-Bez and Shir-Jezhub. And we're going to go with 18. Note 18 here. Isaiah 8:1 through 4 and 7:3. Emmanuel, another symbolic name associated with Isaiah, has already been mentioned. Okay. The first is a Hebrew phrase meaning the spoil speeds, the prey hastes, and is a promise of deliverance to Judah, the two kingdoms threatening it will soon be prey and spoils of war for Assyria. The second is a phrase meaning a remate will return. Though it has an element of promise, it is also a threat that there will be only a remate, speaks of destruction. More dramatic are public acts that amount to street theater. Okay, remember when I said think about people standing on soapboxes on the street corner? That's what he's about to get into. Because some of them did some pretty crazy things to get people's attention. Isaiah, for example, walked naked and barefoot through the streets of Jerusalem for 3 years to symbolize that Judah should not enter a military alliance with Egypt against Assyria, for Assyria would conquer Egypt and carry them off naked and barefoot as prisoners of war. Note 19. Isaiah 20. Public nakedness was shocking in that culture. Presumably, Isaiah did not walk in this manner continually for 3 years, but occasionally over a 3-year period. Yeah, he'd probably end up in jail if he did it all the time. Okay. Jeremiah, who also performed several prophetic acts in the presence of some of the leaders of Jerusalem, he shattered a clay jug, accompanying that gesture with the word, "Thus says the Lord, so will I break this people and the city." Note 20. That is Jeremiah 19. Quoted verse is 19:10. On another occasion, Jeremiah is told by God to wear a wooden yoke on his neck in order to symbolize that Jerusalem and Judea are to wear the yoke of Babylon and not join a military alliance of small kingdoms against Babylon. His act set up one of the classic scenes in Hebrew prophecy, a confrontation between two prophets proclaiming opposite messages. A prophet named Hananiah challenged Jeremiah, broke the wooden yoke Jeremiah was wearing, and proclaimed, "Thus saith the Lord, this is how I will break the yoke of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon." Soon thereafter, Jeremiah announced, in the name of God, words to this effect: "You have broken a wooden yoke, but the God has forged an iron yoke that you will wear." Ooh. That is note 21. Jeremiah 27 through 28. Hananiah was probably a court prophet employed by the king. For the people of the time, it must have been bewildering to see two prophets, both speaking in the name of God, making opposite pronouncements. Ezekiel was the star of prophetic street theater. Shortly before the Babylonian conquest and destruction of Jerusalem, he is told by God to make a model of Jerusalem surrounded by a siege wall, camps, and battering rams. In a public place, he is to lie on his left side for 390 days, then on his right side for 40 days, to symbolize the number of years that Israel and Judah are to spend in exile. During all this time, he is to eat starvation rations, such as would be available in a city under prolonged siege, and he is to bake his bread using human dung as fuel. All of this would symbolize what was to soon happen to Jerusalem. One, roll of thunder. So if the power gets weird, I apologize, and I will finish this when it comes back on, if that comes to it. And two, it's kind of important to know that human dung makes a difference. When you use animal dung to fuel fires, whatever you cook is going to take on the flavor of whatever you are using for fuel. Okay? When you're using cow, they eat mostly grain, so it has a different smell. Humans, on the other hand, are meat eaters, and it smells wildly different and is not appetizing. Again, there's the anthropologist for you. The way I heard the prophets the second time captivated me. I was struck by their passion for social justice, their anti-establishment message, and their warnings of the consequences of facing a society that did not take peace and justice seriously enough. Which, by the way, are all the same reasons why I love the prophets. Their combination of prophetic critique and street theater was perfect for the times. It was the late 1960s, especially to an idealistic college student. The prophets seemed like powerful allies in movements against racism, poverty, and the Vietnam War. I'm not going to talk about the irony that I'm reading this right now in 2026 with what is going on in our world right now. And yet I just did. Hearing the prophets for the third time. But I was to hear the prophets a third time. It was not my second hearing. It was not that my second hearing was wrong. That hearing was simply incomplete. Since then, I now hear the prophets. Oh, hang on. Since then, how I hear the prophet has been added to in three important ways: the prophets and God. I now see that God was utterly central to the prophets. More specifically, I have become convinced that the experiences of the sacred were the source of their sense of mission, their passion for justice, their courage to challenge the established power of domination systems. To explain what I mean, I return for a moment to how I heard the prophets the second time. That hearing was not only perfect for the social activism of the 1960s, it also fit where I was personally in my religious life. During that same period, I had become increasingly uncertain about the reality of God. By my late 20s, my adolescent doubts about God had deepened to the extent that I was virtually a closet atheist. Note 22. I discussed this in more detail in my The God We Never Knew from 1997, page 19 through 26. I don't think I've ever read anything else by Borg. I kind of now want to. In any case, I was a practical atheist or a functional atheist, namely a person who lived as if there was no God. 23. Note 23. It was not that I had become a wild, free-spirited libertine. If anything, I was too serious and too good. I know a lot of atheists, or a fair number of atheists, and most of the atheists I know are good people. They are good because they choose to be good, not because they have a threat to be good. And that says a lot about atheists and actually a whole lot about Christians. So, let's see. And yet, the Bible and Christianity remain very important to me. Thus, the prophets were especially attractive because their focus was on this world, not on another world. They seemed to provide a way of talking seriously a major strand. They seem to provide a way of taking seriously a major strand of the biblical tradition, independent of whether God was real. I heard them as deeply political and only incidentally religious. I heard them as passionate about justice in this world and about destiny and the fate of societies within history. Even if God was not real, these were crucially important matters. Of course, I was aware that the prophets believed in God. That was obvious from their words. After all, most people in their time did. But I took it for granted that the prophets' convictions about God were inherited from tradition, not generated by experience. Though I knew that most of the prophets' books included visions and call stories in which they reported having been commissioned by God, I gave little weight to such stories. I saw them as legitimations of the prophets' mission and message. I imagined that such stories were necessary as responses to those who challenged their radicalism or radical criticism by saying, "What is your authority for what you are saying?" They would say, as Amos did, "The Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" Ooh, note 24, and I just lost my place. Oh yeah, okay, I'm good. Note 24. Amos 7:15. I even wondered whether the visions and call stories were literary creations by followers of the prophet and the people who had collected the prophetic words into books. Note 25. The academic discipline of biblical scholarship that I was then learning did not take these stories seriously either. It was common for biblical scholars to distinguish classical prophets from prophets outside of Israel by saying that a static religious experience was not characteristic of or important to the former. Okay. In short, I did not imagine that God was an experiential reality for the prophets. I did not think of the prophets as having experiences of the sacred. The reason I did not think that such experiences happened. I knew about believing in God, but I did not imagine that people could know God. Okay. And no's in italics, by the way. But now I am convinced that experiences of the sacred do happen, that the prophets had such experiences, and that such experiences were foundational to what they were, said, and did. This claim does not flow out of a more detailed study of the prophets in particular, but from my conviction that such experiences have happened throughout the history and cultures of humankind from antiquity into the present. If one grants that experiences of the sacred do happen, it seems obvious that the prophets had such experiences. Here on note 26. They include Isaiah's dramatic numinous experience of God in the temple, Isaiah 6, Amos's vision, Amos 7:1 through 9 and 9:1, Jeremiah's call and visions, Jeremiah 1:4 through 13, 4:23 through 26, and Ezekiel's visions, possession by the Spirit of God, and traveling in the Spirit, Ezekiel 1 through 3. The thunder's getting really, it's not raining at the moment, but the thunder's bad, so I need to roll on. Okay. Though I recognize that the accounts of their visions, ecstatic states, and calls serve a literary function, I no longer see them as simply literary creations. Though I am not sure that we ever have an exact transcript of the prophetic ecstatic experience, I am convinced that the prophets had such experiences. Having had some mystic experiences myself, words cannot encompass them. The words do not exist to allow you to explain a mystical experience without sounding crazy. It's just the way it is. Taking such experiences seriously. Okay, hang on. Taking such experiences seriously accounts for much of what we see in the prophets. It takes their words seriously. They regularly say, "Thus says the Lord," and they speak in first person on behalf of God. I do not think the words they use come from God. The prophet is a person and not a microphone, as Abraham Herschel put it. Note 27. Abraham Herschel, The Prophet, 2nd edition, 1969, volume 1, page X, which is 10. In other words, the prophet is not simply an amplifier for a divine voice, but speaks out of their own personality and experience. But the words of the prophet suggest that they are speaking from their knowledge of God, not from their knowledge about God, but from their knowing God. That's where you can say experience matters. Their experience of the sacred account for their courage. Their experiences of the sacred account for their courage. They are often in trouble. By command of the king, Amos was ordered to leave the kingdom. Note 28. Amos 7:10 through 17. This is one of the most dramatic confrontation scenes between a prophet and the domination system. The priest Amaziah delivers the king's command in 7:12 through 13. Jeremiah was beaten, put in stocks, threatened with death, forced into hiding, imprisoned, and lowered into a muddy cistern to starve and die. Note 29. That is Jeremiah 20:1 through 6, 26, 1 through 24. Note that a prophet contemporary with Jeremiah is executed by the king. Jeremiah 36, 37, 11 through 21, 38, 1 through 3, which also reports his rescue from the cistern. Oh, well, good, because I was worried there. The prophets all spoke unpopular messages that challenged the rich and powerful, and most, if not all, had to contend with the opposition of court prophets in the service of the monarchy. Their source of courage was God. And you can look at Martin Luther King being a good example, and I merely bring him up because I read an interesting article about his mother. He was assassinated, and then several years later, his mother was assassinated. The woman that shaped Martin Luther King Jr. also was murdered. Their courage was God. They knew that what they were doing could get them killed. And in the end, they paid the ultimate price. But they did it anyway. The prophets' experience of the sacred also account for their affirmations of a God not identified with the social order, but behind and beyond it. Like the God who appeared to Moses in the burning bush, such a God subverts rather than legitimates the social order. Finally, the prophets lived within the traditions of Israel, especially the Exodus and covenant traditions. Thus, they interpreted their experiences of God within the framework of Exodus and covenant. As they looked at their contemporary society, they did not see the kind of community envisioned by the story of the Exodus and the laws associated with it. Ooh, that's kind of important. Which was something I've been thinking about in class. To put the combination together, the prophets had experiences of God. They lived within the traditions of Israel, and they were passionate about social justice. That the three are connected seems apparent. This claim is also the central theme of Abraham Herschel's The Prophets. Herschel was one of the two most influential Jewish theologians of the 20th century in the English-speaking world, and this book, like all his books, is a marvel of insight and language. He emphasizes the same combination. The prophets were passionate about social justice. They were people who knew God. He speaks of their breathless impatience with injustice and affirms that they experienced moments that defy our understanding. These moments were moments of knowing God, and what they experienced in such moments of knowing was a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos. Note 30. You okay, Dante? Herschel, The Prophets, Volume 1, pages 4, 10, and 26, italics in original. The word sympathy here has a much richer meaning than it often does in modern usage, where it commonly means something like, I feel sorry for you. Its roots point to the richer meaning pathos. Its roots point to the richer meaning. Pathos meaning strong feeling, often suffering, but other strong emotions as well. Anger, compassion, love, joy, etc. The prefix sym means with. Thus, sympathy means feeling with, or feeling the feelings of another. For Herschel, the phrase sympathy with the divine pathos means that the prophets felt the feelings of God. Their passion was thus God's passion. It came out of knowing God. Thus, I now see the prophets as more, but not less, than traditional cultural critics with a passion for social justice. I now see them as God intoxicated, as filled with the passion of God, and so I speak of them as God-intoxicated voices of radical social criticism and God-intoxicated advocates of an alternative social vision. Their dream is God's dream. Prophets, peasants, and elites. The second major factor shaping how I now hear the prophets is a more precise understanding of the social system of the world that they addressed. That understanding has enabled me to see the target and content of the prophetic criticism much more clearly. At the heart of that fuller understanding is the model of pre-industrial agrarian society sketched in the previous chapter. These social systems, comprising economic, political, religious, and social structures, were controlled and shaped by elites of power and wealth to serve their own interest. And if you don't think that's what's going on right now in most of the world, you're not paying attention. So thorough was the elite's control that there was no way of countering their self-serving manipulation of the system. Well, I don't think we've got that bad yet, but it's close. But hang on, we're going to read note 31. In the ancient world, there were only two limits on economic exploitation of the peasants by the elites. Subsistence was not to become starvation, and desperation was not to become so great as to incite revolt. Otherwise, the elites had a free hand. Which brings exactly to the mind, eat the rich. When the poor have nothing left, they will eat the rich. And so that's what the elites want to prevent. Okay. This type of society began to develop within Israel with the emergence of the monarchy around 1000 BCE. By the time of Solomon, Israel's third king, the major features of the ancient domination system were in place. A politics of oppression centered on monarchical authority, an economic exploitation centered in the monarchy and the aristocracy, a religion of legitimation centered in the temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem. Thus, by the time the classical prophets began to speak in the 8th century, Israel and Judah had become miniature versions of the ancient domination system, which had enslaved their ancestors in Egypt. The victims, the majority of the population, were Israelites, of course, but now the elites at the top were also Israelites. Egypt had been established in Israel. And we are on to note 32. I owe this way of putting it to Walter Bregerman, Prophetic Imagination from 1978, Chapter 2. Bregerman also says that Solomon, in effect, had become a new pharaoh. Note that this was not a comment on Solomon's personal morality or immorality. It is a comment about the system that emerged under him. Ooh, it's really dark out there. Okay. Seeing this social system as the world addressed by the prophets has been greatly illuminating. Before I was aware of it, I learned the prophetic indictments against Israel in an undifferentiated way, as if the people as a whole were being indicted for injustice. It sounded as if everybody was guilty. This puzzled me. I wondered if perhaps Israel and Judah were especially unjust societies, or if perhaps the standards of the prophets and God were so high as to be ultimately unrealistic. That puzzlement has been replaced by considerable clarity. I now see that most of the prophetic indictments were directed against the elites, who were responsible for creating and maintaining structures of domination and exploitation. A careful reading of the prophets discloses that often the elites are explicitly named, or alternatively, that the offenses named are elite offenses. The prophets indict the elite. They do not blame the victims and hold them responsible for the injustices of their society. Whew. The elites are addressed not only, or even largely, because they had the power to change things, but because it is they who were primarily responsible for Israel's becoming a radically unjust domination system, one hardly different from Egypt. They had deformed Israel, changing her from the Exodus vision of an alternative community living under the lordship of God to just another kingdom living under the lordship of a native pharaoh. Thus, the prophets are not saying that all or most Israelites were equally guilty of social injustice, as if the victims of the system were as responsible as the perpetrators. Rather, they indict the elites of power and wealth at the top of the system on behalf of the victims and in the name of God. Okay. These God-intoxicated figures were utterly convinced that what they saw happening in their midst could not be the will of the God who had liberated Israel from bondage in Egypt. I also have realized that the conflict between domination systems and the will of God runs through the Hebrew Bible as a whole. According to the first book of Samuel, the conflict does not begin in the time of the prophets, but goes back to the origin of the monarchy in Israel in the late 11th century BCE. First Samuel contains two very different traditions about the emergence of kingship. One anti-monarchical, the other pro-monarchical. According to the anti-monarchical tradition, the people asked Samuel to appoint a king over them. This is note 33. 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 22, 10, 17 through 19. Their request displeases both Samuel and God. Indeed, their desire for a king is said to be a rejection of God's kingship. Nevertheless, God grants their request, but with a stern and remarkably precise warning about what a king will do to them. He will take their sons as warriors, conscript them into labor battalions to work in his fields and produce weapons, take their daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, take the best of their fields and vineyards and orchards, and give them to his friends, take 1/10 of their grain and their flocks, take their male and female slaves, and the best of their animals, and put them to his work. And God says to them, you shall be his slaves. 34. That's Samuel 8, 11 through 18. According to the second and pro-monarchical tradition, God's intervention established the monarchy with Saul as its first king. In a charming folk tale that begins with some lost donkeys, God discloses to Samuel that a certain man, Saul, will come to him, whom God has chosen to be king, and that Samuel is to anoint him as such. A confirming sign from God follows. Note 37. Note 35. That is 1 Samuel 9:1 through 10:16. The pro-monarchical tradition surfaces again in 2 Samuel in the promise given by God to King David. David is told that God will establish an everlasting dynasty for him. The throne of his son's kingdom will last forever. Indeed, the king is no less than a son of God. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. 38. Note 36. 2 Samuel 7:1 through 17, especially verses 12 through 16. Also see Psalm 2, one of the royal psalms, so named because it was most likely used as a liturgy for the coronation of a new king. The king, called Son of God and Anointed One, Messiah, is promised that God will establish his throne forever. Which, by the way, that's one of the things you have to remember. Messiah means Anointed One. That's all it means. I keep forgetting that. All right. Let's see. Where was I? In this tradition, Israelite kingship is not only a gift of God, but guaranteed by God to last forever. The social order, the domination system, is ordained by God. The pro-monarchical tradition thus obviously reflects the vantage point and self-interest of the elites. Whoops. Oh, hang on. Sometimes called the royal theology, it shows the way the world looks from the elite point of view. The anti-monarchical tradition reflects prophetic theology. The domination system is not the will of God, but a betrayal of God. It is a rejection of God's kingship. Both points of view are in the Bible, going back to the time of Exodus. The central conflict of the Exodus between the domination system of the Pharaoh and an alternative and much more egalitarian social vision grounded in the character of God is replicated in the conflict between royal theology and prophetic theology within Israel itself. It is more important to note that the conflict is not between the law and prophets, as if it were the law versus the prophets, as scholars of an earlier generation sometimes saw it. From that earlier point of view, the prophets were good and the law was bad. Rather, the conflict is between the law and prophets together against the royal theology of the domination system. Okay. We've got a ways to go. Okay. I still have 10 pages to go, people. Prophetic, energizing the language of hope. The third main feature of how I hear the prophets now is a greater appreciation for prophetic energizing. To explain, Walter Bregman names the two primary dimensions of prophetic activity as prophetic criticizing and prophetic energizing. Note 37. That's Bregman, Prophetic Imagination, Chapter 1. So far in this chapter, we have seen much of the former. Prophetic energizing sounds a different note, and it uses language to generate hope, affirm identity, and create a new future. The pre-destruction prophets. Hey, baby. Yeah, come here. The pre-destruction prophets, those who spoke before the destruction of Israel and Judah, were mostly engaged in prophetic criticism, indicting and warning the elites of what would soon happen unless they abandoned their privilege and sought justice. The post-destruction prophets, on the other hand, those who spoke during and after the exile, were primarily engaged in prophetic energizing. The distinction is relative, however, not absolute. The pre-destruction prophets also used the language of energizing, and the post-destruction prophets also used the language of criticizing. Nevertheless, in general, the pre-destruction prophets spoke against the perpetrators of native domination system on behalf of the victims. The post-destruction prophets spoke to the victims of a new imperial domination system that now ruled over the Jewish people. In my second phase of hearing the prophets, most of my attention was drawn to prophetic criticism, largely because of the time in our society's history. Though I continue to regard that message as vitally important, I am now also very much struck by the prophetic energizing. Second Isaiah and the experience of exile. We see the language of prophetic energizing used with great power and beauty in the second part of the book of Isaiah, commonly called Second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah. Note 38. Isaiah 40 through 55. Deutero is the Greek word for second. In the Bible itself, there is, of course, no one Isaiah and two Isaiah, as there is one Samuel or Second Samuel. There is a distinct change in Isaiah, though. You can definitely see where the language changes, and I believe that I've read that Isaiah may have had 3 different authors. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are primarily from the pre-destruction prophet Isaiah, who spoke to Judah in the 8th century. Chapters 40 through 45 contains the word of Second Isaiah, a Jewish prophet whose name is unknown and who spoke to the Jewish people in exile beginning around the year 539 BCE. Yes, I have read all of Isaiah, at least twice. To appreciate the energizing power of the second Isaiah's language, it is illuminating to set it in the historical context of the Jewish experience in exile. The Babylonian conquest of Judah and Jerusalem in 586 BC not only brought massive death and destruction, as attested by archaeological and literary evidence alike, it also caused widespread desperation and despair among the survivors, many of whom were exiled to Babylon. The experience seared itself into the memory of the Jewish people, and left its mark in the Hebrew Bible. A number of the Psalms reflect the experience of exile. Psalm 137 is especially poignant. Recall that Zion is a mountain in Jerusalem where the now destroyed temple once stood. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept, when we remembered Zion. On the willows, there we hung up our harps. For there our captors us for songs, and our tormentors ask for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That is note 39, Psalm 37, 1 through 4. The last three verses of the psalm express the anger of exile, beseeching God to avenge the Israelites and blessing those who will smash the children of their enemies against a rock. The Psalms were traditionally attributed to King David, just as the Pentateuch is attributed to Moses. However, the Psalms, as a collection of hymns, prayers, and liturgies, were written over many centuries, including the post-exilic period. Other Psalms that most likely reflect the experience of exile are 42 through 44, 74, 77, 80, 85, and 126. And literally, all of the rest of the notes, or the rest of the notes for the next several, are just going to tell you which Psalms, where he's quoting from, because he's about to do a whole bunch of quoting. The Book of Lamentations is a sustained expression of grief and pain. The author personifies personifies Jerusalem as a woman and mourns her desolation. How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow. Note 40, that is Lamentations 1 through 2, and 11 through 12. Much of the book describes the lives of the survivors with precision and anguish. Its concluding chapters begins, "Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance, the promised land, has been turned over to strangers, our home to aliens. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. With a yoke on our necks, we are hard driven. We are weary. We are given no rest. Women are raped in Zion, virgins in the towns of Judah. Our princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. Young men are compelled to grind, and boys stagger under loads of wood. The old men have left the city gate, the young men their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned to mourning. Mount Zion lays desolate. Jackals prowl over it." Okay, that's 41, which tells you that it's Lamentations 5, 1 through 5, 11 through 15, and 18. The last three verses of Lamentations express with great power the hive of emotions felt in exile. The bitter pain of feeling abandoned, the desperate desire for restoration, the gnawing apprehension of having been forsaken and forgotten forever, the anxious fear that things will always be the same and never get better. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourselves, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. 2nd Isaiah and the return from exile. In this historical setting, 2nd Isaiah spoke his message of prophetic energizing. He is the prophet of the return from exile. In the return from exile became politically possible when the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persian Empire in 539 BC. Persian imperial policy permitted the return of exiled peoples to their homelands, but the return from exile could not be taken for granted. The Jewish exiles were a weakened community, weakened in power, wealth, identity, and spirit. Most of them had been born in exile in Babylon. Only a few were still alive who remembered Jerusalem and Zion. For most, life in the Promised Land was a faint and second-hand memory. They had put down roots, even if the roots were in Babylon. Moreover, the journey would be long and difficult. About 1,000 miles through mostly empty semi-desert landscape. It would be on foot. Undertake this journey? It was no small thing. Second Isaiah's task is to announce and encourage, to proclaim and empower the return from exile. His energizing language is among the most magnificent in the Bible. It is no accident that much of it is familiar to us from Handel's Messiah. The primary content of his message is announced in a passage that probably reflects his call to be a prophet. The tone and content are very different from the pre-destruction prophets. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term and that her penalty is paid. Note 42. Isaiah 4, 1 through 2, the opening verses of 2nd Isaiah. 2nd Isaiah's message is that God is preparing the way of return. Using metaphors of a superhighway being built in the desert, he declares to the exiles victimized by the domination system of Babylon, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places plain. Note 43, Isaiah 43 and 4. Second Isaiah recognizes the exiles' despairing sense of having been forgotten by God and recites their lament. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? And that is Isaiah 40:27. He counters their despondency with energizing affirmations of their identity. He reminds them of who they are in God's sight: precious, honored, loved, remembered. But now, thus says the Lord, the one who created you, O Jacob, the one who formed you, O Israel. Do not be afraid, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, and you are mine. You are precious in my sight and honored, and I love you. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. And that is Isaiah 43, 1 and 4 and 5. He assures them that God will not forget even one of them, for they and their offspring are sons and daughters of God. I will bring your offspring from the east and from the west. I will gather you up. I will say to the north, gather them up, and to the south, do not withhold. Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from one end of the earth, and everyone who is called by name. And that is Isaiah 43, 5 and 6. The imagery of God as parent and Israel as God's sons and daughters continues in a passage that boldly compares God to a mother nursing her child. The gnawing fear of the exiles surfaces again. The Lord has forsaken me, my Lord has forgotten me. In the name of God, 2nd Isaiah says, can a woman forget her nursing child, or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Isaiah 49, 14 and 15. He not only assures the exiles that they are remembered by God, but promises God's empowering presence in the difficult journey of return. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is an everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. God does not faint or grow weary. God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. That is Isaiah 40:27 through 31. God is the shepherd of Israel. God will feed the flock like a shepherd, gather the lambs, carry them, and gently lead those who are with young. Isaiah 40:11. To the community of exiles, newness seemed impossible, but 2nd Isaiah announces that God is doing a new thing. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Isaiah 42:9. The new thing is nothing less than a new exodus, in language that recalls the exodus from Jesus. I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings out chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, quenched like a wick. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Isaiah 43:15 through 19. The energizing language of 2nd Isaiah worked. The words that went forth from his mouth did not return empty, but accomplished that which God proposed. For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the fields shall clap their hands. Echoing Isaiah 55:11 and quoting 55:12. A significant number of the Jewish exiles returned to their homeland, though some remained in Babylon. Within a generation, the returning remnant had rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, a temple that, because of the relatively impoverished status of the exile, was much more modest in size and splendor than the earlier temple built by King Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians. Though the exiles continued for several centuries to be under the political control of a series of foreign empires, they were back in the promised land. They were home. The prophetic energizing we encounter in 2nd Isaiah came from the same place as the prophetic criticizing in the pre-destruction prophets. 2nd Isaiah must have known the energizing power of God in his own experience. Only so could he have energized and empowered his community to embark on the journey of return. Concluding reflections. In other words, we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Prophetic criticizing and energizing are most relevant to our time when we hear what the prophets were saying in their time, not when we divorce them from their time and imagine that they were predicting a distant future. Though their language is full of metaphor, as poetic language always is, we hear them most clearly when we hear them most historically. In much of Christian history, their voices have not been clearly heard. They have usually been domesticated, often by those choosing to see them as predictors of Jesus as the Messiah. The domestication is to a large extent the product of Christendom, a wedding of Christianity with Western culture, a union that began with Constantine in the 4th century and ended only recently. During the centuries that Christianity slept with the dominant culture, it did not, and in a sense could not, see the prophets as voices of radical social protest against domination systems. And so the prophets were made safe, either by ignoring them or making them irrelevant. End In our time, the end of Christendom creates the possibility of hearing and reading the prophets again as God-intoxicated voices articulating the dream of God. Note 53. I owe this wonderful phrase to Verna Dozier, The Dream of God, from 1991. God's dream is a world of justice and peace. The nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall all sit under their own vines and their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid. Note 54, that is Micah 4:3-4. The full oracle in Micah 4:1-4 is almost exactly paralleled in Isaiah 2:2-4, suggesting that it was widely known in prophetic circles. For more than one reason, communicating the prophetic passages for social justice is difficult in the church in North America. Gee, I wonder why. Today. Some of us continue to be blinded by the blinkers of prediction and fulfillment. We also resist hearing the prophets because they easily make us, as residents of an affluent society, uncomfortable. Yet another reason is that the word justice has multiple meanings in our culture, and the most common of them has little to do with the prophetic meaning of justice. I became aware of this while teaching the prophets to undergraduates. I was puzzled that my students didn't get very excited as I passionately exposited as I passionately exposited the prophet's passion for justice, even though I found the prophets to be the most exciting part of my college years. My students dutifully took notes, but nothing remarkable seemed to be happening. So I paused and asked them, when I say the word justice, what do you think of? After some silence, one student says, I think of the criminal justice system. I realized that his response made sense. After all, in the United States, the Department of Justice is concerned with criminal justice, and its head is spoken of as the nation's chief law enforcement official. But if one hears the prophet's passion for justice as being about convicting and punishing criminals, one has not heard them at all. Yet, another common meaning of justice is procedural justice. Procedural justice is concerned with fair play, with ensuring that the procedures, law and legal proceedings, are the same for everybody and are enforced the same for everybody. Because the concern of that sort of justice is the individual and individual rights, it fits nicely within the core of American cultural value of individualism. Rather than challenging the ethos of individualism, it supports it. Of course, procedural justice does matter and matters greatly, especially in the areas of criminal justice and human rights. But it's still not what the prophets meant. A third meaning of justice is social justice. More comprehensive than criminal justice and procedural justice, social justice is concerned with the structures of society and their results. Because it is results-oriented, it discerns whether the structures of society, in other words, the social system as a whole, are just in their effects. Do they produce a large impoverished class or result in a more equitable distribution of resources? Do they benefit some at the expense of many or serve all equally? Do they produce conflict or peace? Do they destroy or nourish a future? One can imagine a society with very good procedural justice being nevertheless filled with social injustice. For example, one can imagine Pharaoh's Egypt or the Third Reich having perfect procedural justice They did not, of course, but one can imagine it. And laws that were impeccably enforced, and yet one cannot imagine concluding that these were just societies. Social justice is about more than the fair enforcement of laws and procedures. It is concerned with the justice of social systems. Its opposite is systemic injustice. Almost there. Social justice is a kind of justice that the prophets proclaim. Their passion of their prophetic criticism challenges us, for the conflict between the dream of God and the domination system of this world is persistent. It not only runs through the history of ancient Israel, but surfaces again in the time of Jesus. A conflict between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of Herods and Caesars of this world. And, to say the obvious, this conflict abides with us to this day. The structuring of society by elites to serve their self-interest continues. We have note 55. In the contemporary United States, we see this in the naming of high taxes as a, or perhaps the, primary political issue. The anti-tax sentiment of our society is fueled and financed primarily by the wealthy. Can anybody seriously believe that the anti-tax movement serves the interest of society as a whole and not simply the narrow self-interest of the wealthy? Unfortunately, many do. Elites know how to shape public opinion and thus the system as a whole. Yeah, let's talk about the big, beautiful bill that gave massive tax cuts to the wealthy and will close rural hospitals which serve the less wealthy. Okay. The message of prophetic energizing also remains relevant today, relevant to the victims and the exile of the domination systems of our time. It proclaims that their identity, value, and worth are grounded not in culture but in God's regard. It affirms that God's character, will, and justice are different from the justice of oppressive social orders. It is also relevant to those of us of Pharaoh's household who yearn for a different kind of society. Note 56. The Pharaoh's household is a metaphor for those who derive benefits from the domination system without being primarily responsible for it or even in favor of it. In other words, those of us with privilege, but who aren't necessarily elite. And I can say that because part of my privilege is the color of my skin. Newness is possible. The future does not have to replicate the past. The dream of God is alive. More so than prophetic criticizing, prophetic energizing reminds us of the reality of God. After all, one can be passionate about social justice without God, but the prophets were passionate about both God and justice. They bring together the same two emphases we have heard in the Exodus story, the spiritual and the social, God and justice, the sacred and this world. At the center of the spiritual life, the life with God, is a twofold relationship with God and the world of every day, including the way the world of the everyday is structured. We see this with special clarity in 2nd Isaiah. In addition to the historical meanings his words had for Jewish exiles in the 6th century, he has also bequeathed to us the language of exile and return as powerful religious metaphors. Exile, with all its metaphorical resonances, is a rich metaphor for the human condition and how we often experience our lives. We feel much of what ancient Israel felt in exile: grief, anguish, longing, weakness, homelessness. The solution for exiles is, of course, a journey of return, a way or a path through the wilderness. Imagining the religious life as a way or path or journey is central not only to 2nd Isaiah, but also in Judaism and Christianity and in other religious traditions. Both Judaism and Christianity are about a way. Indeed, the word repent, so central to the Christian traditions, has its roots in the Jewish story of the exile. To repent does not mean to feel really bad about sin. Rather, it means to embark upon a path of return. The journey begins in exile, and the destination is a return to life in the presence of God. The journey of return leads to the place where we began, to the paradise and Jerusalem and Zion, all symbolizing the place of God's presence. Of course, we are never outside the presence of God, even when we do not believe that or know that. The way, the path, leads to the place where we do know that. The journey of return, of which 2nd Isaiah speaks, leads to life in the presence of God, to the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And that is the end of chapter 6. And the storm has definitely rolled in, and my hands are screaming from holding the book for 2 hours now. I need to start this a little earlier because these chapters are taking a while to read. I did not know what I had signed up for, but I'm committed. It's okay. So that was chapter 6, reading the prophets again from Marcus Borg, reading the Bible again for the first time. I'm going to go get a nice long drink of water. Have a wonderful evening. Stay out of the thunderstorms. Be safe if you are driving anywhere. Have a good evening. I'm sure Reverend David will be on soon. And I'll see you about 8:45 tomorrow. Do remember, it is time change. Spring forward tonight. All right, beloveds, take care of yourself. Know that you are loved, and I will see you.